Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, welcome back to it. Welcome back to your second flip of this brand new school year, right? We left off in class talking today about ancient Greek geography, right? But we dove in really headfirst in the content today, right? Really got in knee deep in plant domestication, animal domestication, early human history, Paleolithic versus Neolithic, and the importance of farming and all of its big positive and negative outcomes, and talked about what makes a civilization a civilization. We also discussed how we're going to be skipping over a lot of the little stuff like Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt and stuff like that. We're going to be diving headfirst into ancient Greece, the very first Western civilization, right? The very first of our civilizations that pops up right out of the Mediterranean Sea and begins to show up, prosper and blossom and spread its influence throughout the rest of Europe, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is we left off talking about ancient Greek geography and the time periods, right? So we're going to come back to the time periods here in about 2 seconds, right? But before you can ever really even understand the time periods and how they work, you got to understand ancient Greek geography, right? So we talked a lot about geography and the geography of Greece in general. We spent a little bit of time talking about how Greece is actually very mountainous and does not have huge swaths of flat terrain, and how that's going to actually lead to a very important thing known as geographic isolation of early city-states, right? It's why Athens and Sparta are so different. It's why 2 of the big dogs that we're about to talk about today are going to be so very different and stuff like that. There's very importance when it comes to that geographic isolation. The fact that the mountains are going to separate early settlements and make it so they grow up very individual and unique from one another, right? Make sure you have that down. Make sure you know what geographic isolation is, all right? Please make sure you know. It doesn't have to just be mountains either when you're talking about Western civilizations. It can be bodies of water. It can be treacherous terrain like deserts and things like that. But geographic isolation is going to be important when we're talking about the early forms of ancient Greek city-states. They also do not have very good farmland. That 20% farmland is very important to note. It's going to be the only thing that's going to be able to sustain is a few crops, and only a couple of things grow really well there. And the other big thing about it is the only animal that they could really keep alive for very long periods of time there was lamb and goats, which is why it's a heavy part of Greek cuisine even to this day, right? That's why feta cheese is made out of goat's milk, right? I know, I think Nicole and I talked about that today, right? She's a big fan of the lamb meat and the gyros and stuff like that, as am I. Gyro meat is fantastic. Now, the big thing about it, though, as well, is it's bordered by 2 seas, the Ionian on this side and the Aegean on this side, which we have a very special story that we'll talk about in our next class about the Aegean and where it gets its name from. And the big thing, though, we are diving headfirst into as well is we're going to pick up right where we left off talking about the only things that grow well in ancient Greece, right? The things that grew really well in ancient Greece that are going to be really important trade goods for them. Dublin, shout out Dublin. She knew this whole thing. She understood trade is going to be very important to them because they're next to a big body of water like the ocean and stuff like that, which is very good. And I think it was Reese that was fishing or whatever at one point in B period and stuff like that. Good stuff. And F period, I'm sure y'all are going to have a lot of really great answers as well. I'm recording this before I see you, and I'm sure Cadence in the back is going to have a lot of really great things to say, but we'll get there when we get there, right? Now, the thing about it, though, in general, is that the only things that grew really well in ancient Greece are grains, grapes, and olives, right? By grains, I mean wheat and barley. It does grow really well there, even though the early Greeks had it brought to them by people like the Mesopotamians and the Sumerians, who grew it very well, and pearl barley and certain types of grains and wheat do grow really well in the arid, dry climate of lower Greece and things like that, right? And also, these things can survive without tons and tons of fresh water, right? They don't need to be watered constantly or very often, and they live so well that this olive tree that actually exists in Greece is 2,000 years old, which is bananas, right? And it's still growing and still producing olives, right? Olives became a major trade commodity for early Greeks as well because they can make olive oil and stuff like that out of it. And as well, the other big thing is grapes can make wine, right? Which is going to lead to potting for them and the need to actually put these things in containers. But we'll get to all that stuff when we get to it, right? We will talk about all that stuff when we get to that a little bit closer to archaic Greece, right? But let's go ahead and jump head first into this bad boy known as the Greek time periods, right? So we looked at our ancient Greek time periods, and we had the Neolithic, Early Bronze, Minoan, Mycenaean. Over the next 2 days, we are going to knock out Neolithic, Early Bronze, Minoan, Mycenaean. We're going to go ahead head first and bang all those things out real quick, right? And then we're going to have a slower approach to the Dark Ages, Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic, right? We're spend all next week doing those. And then we're going to have a little wrap up, and then we're going to jump head first into your first test, right? Your first test is going to be that next week right before Labor Day, okay? So getting into it, though, when you guys start off, when you're talking about all this stuff, you have to start off with the Neolithic period, right? So we're going to be going through those time periods that we talked about today in class and kind of just checklisting them off a little bit, right? We're going to be okay, we talked about that. 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 Like, so we're just going to be moving through them in that sense, right? So Neolithic Greece is a really, really great place to start because it's the first one. So 7000 BC is going to be when the earliest forms of settlement and civilization is going to show up on the isle or on the peninsula that you now know of as Greece. That Evie in my B period or my C period class knew exactly where it was, and I was very, very impressed. So the big thing about it, though, is Neolithic Greece, which starts in 7000 BC and goes up to 32,000 BC, is just going to be a very basic time period. It's just the earliest signs of civilization, right? Neolithic people, it means that they're going to start showing evidence of early cities and farming and maybe of like pottery and religion, but very rudimentary style like settlements. No writing yet, no huge grandiose forms of art yet, just some artifacts that we have laying around like early pots and vessels and stuff like that, and maybe possibly some signs of religion with like small rock carved like idols and things like that. We found tons of them actually, which is really, really interesting. And this also really goes into archaeology as well, and how archaeologists really like to go through people's trash in ancient civilizations, and that's why so many pots are like broken fragments, because we have all this stuff in one spot, and we can kind of re-piece things together. This right here is a Neolithic Greek pot that's showing you they are beginning to start doing some art forms and things like that, and that they actually are having civilizations and small farming communities in Greece showing up around 7000 BC. Now, and as you can tell though, man, 3,800 years worth of time that they were there, and they hadn't really advanced in a gigantic way yet, right? But it takes human beings a long time to actually advance over like through these different phases. But the next phase is going to be a very important one, which is a little bit of the weird one. So this next phase, this next time period of ancient Greece, because remember, Neolithic, we're already done with it. We're moving past it. The next time period that we got to go up, so we got Neolithic period, Nathan, on the Nathan eats bacon, check, that's done. Early Bronze Greece, right? The early Bronze era Greece is going to be very important as well. It's going to last from about like 3200 BC to about 2000 BC. But it's a real bit of a weird situation because there's this thing called the Bronze Age as well. We'll talk a lot about that in class, especially when we go over it during a warm-up sometime and things like that. But what it's defined by, the early Bronze era, is by the introduction into these Neolithic communities, the introduction of forgeable metals, right? So the earliest Greeks that haven't even really devised huge systems of writing yet are beginning to now forge metal, right? Now, when I mean forgeable metals, right? I know somebody in class today was bringing up, it's like, oh, these are a lot of words that I just don't really know yet, right? Well, let's talk about forgeable, right? Forgeable metal means it's a metal that is soft enough to where you can heat it up, smelt it out of a rock, and you can pound it into certain shapes, and it keeps an edge, right? So we can make weapons out of it, tools out of it, garden tools out of it, or like farming tools out of it, and a lot of other things that are going to help them survive, right? So now this forgeable metal that was first introduced, though, is going to be the metal known as bronze, right? And it's going to be first smelted and created in Mesopotamia and some other areas like that. I think Egypt gets it a little bit later as well. But the thing about it, though, is bronze is a very important metal. You know it very, very well because of some of the chemicals that is actually used to make it. Well, not the chemicals, but the metals that are actually used to make it and stuff like that. But what early Greeks would use to do it is they would make a lot of weapons, and they would make some of their earliest forms of art out of bronze as well, right? Now, naturally, bronze does not have this greenish color, right? It actually has that color right now because it's being oxidized, right? And it's actually aging over time. It's a big reason because of why the Statue of Liberty is like actually the color that it is. Now, the Statue of Liberty is not made out of bronze, but it's made out of a very important element that is made in bronze. So here's the big thing about bronze. Bronze is an alloy, right? And the introduction of bronze to the Neolithic Greeks is very important because they're beginning to make sharpened edge tools and they're beginning to forge metals, and it's showing a progression of their society, right? But what is bronze? What is bronze? Why does it turn green? Why does it do these things? Bronze is an alloy or a mixture of two specific types of metal. Those two metals are known as the following things. You should probably write this down. These two metals are copper and tin, right? Tin is in the stuff that makes tin cans, and copper is in the stuff that pennies are made out of and the Statue of Liberty. When copper oxidizes, it turns green, right? Which is why it actually has this like mixed green color into it, right? So bronze, being made out of copper and tin, is a very important landmark moment in ancient Greek culture because they're beginning to advance themselves, make weaponry, make art, make different items now out of metal rather than just out of clay or mud or other like sedimentary-based goods, right? So the thing going into it is we are beginning to advance, right? So we started out as Neolithic and it's just villages and farming, and now we're advancing into the Bronze era and we're starting to make things out of metal, right? That's a really big deal. So boom, early bronze, check. Our Nathan eats bacon is now done, right? Now we got to get into our meanwhile mommies, right? Now we got to get into our meanwhiles and our other parts, and we got to talk about the first one. Y'all are like, okay, and then the next one starts with the M. And you're right, it does. So it's time to get serious, right? We now have ticked through the first two time periods, Neolithic period, the Neolithic Greece and early Bronze Greece. So we now have time to get serious with a more intense society that's going to pop up in ancient Greece, right? And those people you might have heard of before, but I bet you money you've heard of a myth that has to do about them. But we'll talk a lot about that as well. But they're the people known as the Minoans, right? The Minoans are going to pop up around 2000 BC, at the end of the early Bronze period. But really, really quickly, just because the early Bronze period is over, does not mean that actually the Minoans didn't use bronze, right? They still did, because there's this whole thing called the Bronze Age. The early bronze just kind of starts the Bronze Age, right? So the thing about it, though, in general, is the Minoans are going to show up. Fantastic wielders of bronze, very, very good smelters of this item, and they're also a very advanced civilization. No longer just Neolithic farming communities that happen to be forging metal. We're now getting into the first civilizations that existed in Greece, right? And the Minoans is that first civilization, right? And on a scale of 1 to 10, I always like to ask this before we get started. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you think we know about the Minoans? Anybody? Anybody? I got some guesses. I hear Madison over there. Madison's like 3. And then I got somebody over there that's just like, I think it's like Cassidy over there. It's just like 7. No, actually, it's more like a 2. All right, so like now the thing about it is we don't know a ton of stuff about the Minoans for sure. That's actually really, really sad because we've only actually known about them in the historical community for about like 100 years and change. So we did not even discover Minoan artifacts until the 1900s. That's crazy. These people started in 2000 BC, 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, and we just recently discovered their items, right? Which is crazy. And actually, this is the guy that discovered them. His name is Sir Arthur Evans, and he's an archaeologist, and he discovered the earliest pieces of the Minoan culture around 1907, right? Him and several friends and several archaeologist friends just took tools and shovels over to this very specific place in Greece, and we need to know where this specific place is, but Sir Arthur Evans and his team of archaeologists just went digging around on an island off the coast of Greece. And that island is right here, okay? And you need to write this island down. So this is the mainland area of Greece, and all of the islands off Greece's coast are considered Greek as well, right? And this island is the very first home to a complex civilization in ancient Greece, right? The Minoans lived on this island, and that island's name is Crete. C-R-E-T-E, okay? Crete, the island of Crete. Make sure you know who that is, where that is, because it's going to be on your first map quiz. Now, the big thing about it, though, is that island of Crete, being so flinging important, is going to be home to the Minoan settlement that we use to study them, and it's the archaeological facts and pieces that we always go back to look at when we're talking about the Minoans, and we're going to get into their culture and things that make Minoans very Minoan and stuff like that. But the thing is the palace that Sir Arthur Evans discovered when he actually discovered who the Minoan people were is known as the Palace of Kenosis, right? When Arthur Evans and his team of archaeologists were digging around, they stumbled upon this place. A massive palace complex that was hidden beneath the dirt, and no one knew it was there. Sir Arthur Evans and his team started uncovering it, reconstructing some parts of it, and it turns out that they found a massive palace that was home to a people that he named the Minoans. But the name of that actual place is the Palace of Kenosis, right? Kenosis is going to be the main place that we actually harvested most Minoan artifacts from. Now, there's this other one called the Phaistos disc that we'll talk about a little bit later on as well, but it turns out that we believe that the Minoans had several different palaces, a lot like Kenosis, all over the island of Crete, and that they were a very strong and prominent civilization that is very important that you know who they are, right? And we think that when the Palace of Kenosis was fully constructed, it looked a lot like this, right? Now, all things considered, do we have much of it left? No, we don't have much of Kenosis left, but we believe when it was fully constructed, it looked something like this, which is a beautiful complex that included courtyards and big open areas. And surprisingly enough, no walls, right? Most ancient civilizations have walls around their palaces to protect from like invaders and marauders and outside armies and stuff like that. But Kenosis didn't have any. And I wonder why. We'll get into that, actually, especially in class and during a warm-up. We'll get into why they didn't have any walls, and a lot of it has to do with their boats and stuff, right? Like I said now, but the big thing about it is the Minoans look as though they are very, very advanced, right? And they are, right? Located on the island of Crete. We don't know a lot about them. We don't know a ton, but we do know that they are the foundations, culturally, of what we call, in the modern era, Greek, right? Or Greek people, right? Now, the thing about it is when we're actually studying the Minoans, you have to understand where they're located on Crete. this right here being a map of Crete. We believe the Kenosis settlement is right here. Phaistos became another one that we uncovered as well. They had a palace complex there as well. Malaya and Zakros are several other Minoan areas that actually show their settlements on Crete, right? So after Sir Arthur Evans and his team began to uncover artifacts, we started seeing artifacts all over the island of Crete. But why do we call them the Minoans? Like, what's the point? Why do we call them the Minoans? A lot of it has to do with an ancient Greek myth, right? An ancient Greek myth that we will talk about a lot in class, and we'll talk about the purpose of myths and stuff like that in this flip and whatever. But the name Minoans is very, very... And the reason why their name is so important is because it's directly related to a character from the myth that we're going to talk about a lot in class, right? And that character's name is King Minos, right? Like, so King Minos, jot that down. It's who the Minoans are named after, right? King Minos, A is in like king, you know how to spell king, and then Minos, M-I-N-O-S, right? King Minos is believed to have ruled over this island nation in a Greek myth that comes all the way from ancient Athens. That was actually written over 1,000 years after the Minoans had already died off and stuff. But King Minos is the mythological figure that Sir Arthur Evans believed lived at the Palace of Kenosis because of the way that the Palace of Kenosis is constructed, right? The principal site, the Palace Kenosis of the Minoan Kingdom, we're so not sure about a lot of things about it. But we named it the Minoans, and we named this Palace of Kenosis after King Minos because of the way that it was built, right? Because it was built in a labyrinth-like format, right? And what a labyrinth is, jot this word down underneath labyrinth real quick, is a maze, right? There's an ancient Greek myth that has to do with King Minos and the palace that he lives in being very maze-like, right? And when we uncovered all of these different walls and things like that on the inside of the Palace of Kenosis, it looks as though we might have found that person's house, right? This thousands-year-old myth where we never knew where this dude lived or if King Minos was ever real. Maybe we actually found his house because when we uncovered the Palace of Kenosis remains, this looks pretty maze-like to me. Look at all the numbers of hallways and the walls and the different areas and all the different rooms. This is really important, and it's a big reason why they named it after King Minos, right? This labyrinth-like format is very important. And it's the principal site of the Minoan Kingdom, and here's the weirdest part about it. We're not even sure really what it is. It could be a palace that was dedicated to the leader of the Minoans. It could also be a marketplace, though, because there's a lot of different little elements to, like, the interior areas in some of the artifacts. Like this, for example, is a throne with what it looks like in front of an offering plate. Maybe the Palace of Kenosis was also a marketplace where farmers and stuff like that would bring their wares and maybe trade for other items with other individuals, because there's so many stalls and rooms and areas inside of this big complex that we're really not positive exactly what it was used for. Maybe the king of the Minoans used it as an area of taxation. Like, if, for example, like if Dublin grew like some wheat or something like that and she owed me 10% of it as being her king or whatever, maybe it was a site of the earliest forms of taxation. We're really not like very, very positive, but we do know that the Palace of Kenosis is very, very intricate and very, very advanced, right? And very, very advanced in the sense of, look at the architecture, right? Look at the stonework and stuff. And these bad boys, for anybody that's taken Mr. Broussard's Fine Arts Appreciation class, Fine Arts Survey, can spot one of these from a mile away. This is a very, very Greek architectural concept. They're known as Greek columns. Now, these specifically are Minoan-style Greek columns. And we'll talk about the other Greek columns that pop up during the Archaic period, like the Doric and the Ionic and the Corinthian and all those ones. But the big thing about it is these Doric columns, or like not Doric columns, these Minoan columns are very important. And they're very different from other Greek columns that came along a little bit later, but at least it demonstrates some early cultural Greek things, right? All Greeks would build with columns. The Minoans were the first Greeks to build with columns, right? Now, Minoan columns are actually red, and they're made out of wood and stuff like that, and they taper towards the bottom, so they're intrinsically different, but we can still see very, very important things, right? And look at the retaining walls and the stairs that have been like kept around. And here's the other even crazy thing about the Palace Kenosis. They were such an advanced people, they had plumbing. They actually had water that ran underneath the palace complex, and anytime someone would use the bathroom inside of it, it would wash the stuff away. And some of you are like, plumbing's not that big of a deal. What's the big deal? For thousands of years in Europe, even after the Romans and the Greeks, people just didn't have plumbing, all right? Like, so plumbing is actually a very, very modern, smart thing to do, to wash away human waste and send it someplace else, right? Because for a long time, ancient people were just going to the bathroom in buckets and then pitching it out into the woods, right? So, like, this is a very advanced thing that demonstrates the intelligence of the Minoan people, right? We've also found bull artifacts everywhere, right? Which is a really, really important thing, and it kind of tells us a lot about if the ancient Greeks actually knew who they were, right? Because we don't know if they know that we know that the Greeks knew that they were there. It kind of feels like this.
Oh my God. Oh my God, she knows about us. Joey, do they know that we know?
No.
Joey?
They know you know.
Oh, I knew it! They don't know that we know they know we know. And Joey, you can't say anything.
Couldn't if I wanted to.
Exactly, right? Like, we don't know that they know that we know, but we're pretty sure that the ancient Greeks knew of the Minoans to a certain extent, right? The Athenians that came 1,000 years after the Minoans, they didn't have ways to really to write down if the Minoans exist or not, so they used myths to talk about them a lot. And a really important myth that has so much to do related to the Minoans, we believe anyway, is related to bulls, right? So and there's a lot of bull artifacts that have been found inside the Palace of Kenosis. For example, this one is an artwork that's found on the inside of one of the palace walls. It's called the bull leaping fresco. And it appears from this image right here that there might have been a ceremony in the Minoan kingdom where they would literally perform a big ceremony where this guy's busting a backflip off this bull's back and this dude looks like he's been gored or stabbed by it or something like that. But there also are other big things where it's there's this, which demonstrates bull horns and stuff like that. And so do we think that the later Greeks knew about them? Yeah, we're pretty sure that they did, and a lot of it has to do with this myth that came quite some time after the Minoans had already fallen. Myths from over 1,000 years later tell us a lot more than the artifacts of the Palace of Kenosis ever really can, because it's all about the purpose of Greek myths, right? So Greek myths, the thing that you already know about that involves Zeus and Hercules and Aphrodite and all those, not Hercules, it's actually Heracles. All those other figures are used for a very specific reason. So we're going to give an answer to this question really quick. What is the purpose of these myths that were written thousands of years after over 1,000 years after the Minoans had already fallen? Well, the purpose of these myths is to kind of replace history and science when people didn't know how to use them properly, right? So science didn't really exist in the way it exists now during the ancient Greek time periods, during the Minoan culture, during the Athenian culture, during the Spartan culture later on. The thing about it is that they used mythology and stories about their religion and gods and goddesses to answer questions that they just didn't know the answer to. For example, why does the sun rise and set? Well, the Greeks had a myth that Apollo, the god of the sun, would drag the sun across the sky throughout the day, and that's why they believed that the sun rises and set. Why did lightning bolts happen? Because Zeus is angry and stuff like that. Where do the gods live? On top of Mount Olympus and things like that. So the really good evidence that we have that we believe that later Greeks knew who the Minoans were is mostly due to a myth, right? And so this one about Theseus and the Minotaur that we'll talk about tomorrow in class and stuff like that. But why don't we know more about the Minoans? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that their writing is undecipherable, right? That right there is a dollar-level word. That's a big word, right? Undecipherable means we can't read it, right? And so since we can't read it, we've given it a very stupid name, and it's called Linear A. We have actually discovered evidence of their writing, of Minoan writing, and it's right here, and this is the best example of it that we have, and it's known as the Phaistos disc, right? The Phaistos disc was discovered at another palace nearby on the area of Phaistos, and we have no idea what this says. We have no clue. So historians rely way more on their art than we ever did on their writing. And the art that they made is known as a fresco. And this right here is what a fresco looks like. And we'll talk specifically about why frescoes are important and why it shows us just how smart the Minoans are when I see y'all in our next class, okay? So I'll see y'all then. We'll wrap up the Minoans really quick. We'll dive headfirst into the Mycenaeans, and we'll start really getting after it, all right? But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.